Chapter 49 is a very fascinating chapter. It's one that is quite often overlooked, but it shouldn't be, because it contains prophecies and it contains statements made by Jacob that are significant, and we're going to see that as we go through. Then Jacob summoned his sons and said, "Assemble yourselves, that I may tell you what will befall you in the days to come." He's indicating to his sons who are gathered there with him, he's in his last days of life. He's telling his sons that what he's about to tell them is predictive. He's going to tell them what is to come, what will be their fate. And I would have to assume, I have to believe correctly, that Jacob was under the influence of the Holy Spirit when he said these words. Even though Moses does not explicitly tell us, what we're going to be seeing in this text, I believe, gives credence to the view that he was inspired at this point with a prophetic gift, and he was able to foretell what would take place. Verse 2 is a parallelism. He says, "Gather together and hear, O sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel your father." So hear, listen, that's a parallelism. The sons of Jacob are going to be gathered together to listen to their father. Verse 3, he begins, "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power." Normally, the firstborn would receive the birthright. Normally, the firstborn would be the leader. At this point, you would assume that to be the case. But then Jacob says, "Uncontrolled as water, you shall not have preeminence." I believe the King James puts it, "unstable as water." New American Standard says, "uncontrolled as water." He's reckless. You can't control him. He can't control himself. Then he explains, "You shall not have preeminence." That means he would not receive the birthright. He would not receive it. Because, here's the reason, "you went up to your father's bed." Now, when did he do this? All the way back in chapter 35 with Bilhah. He slept with Bilhah. "Then you defiled it. He went up to my couch." Because he did that, he says he cannot have the birthright. Now, what is the fate of the tribe of Reuben? That tribe settled east of the Jordan River. It became obscure. And eventually that tribe, the territory of that tribe, was lost to the Moabites. Unstable as water, just as Jacob had foretold. Then he continues, "Simeon and Levi are brothers." Well, of course, they're brothers. All 12 of them are brothers. What is Jacob meaning by that? Simeon and Levi are brothers. He's saying Simeon and Levi are just alike. You ever said that about two of your kids? They're just alike. Simeon and Levi are brothers. They're right along with each other. Then he says, "Their swords are implements of violence." Remember all the way back in chapter 34, verses 25 through 30, what they did? They took the lead in the violence that happened on that occasion. Then he says, "Let my soul not enter into their counsel. Let not my glory be united with their assembly, because in their anger they slew men." He's referring to the massacre of the Shechemites in chapter 34, verse 25. "And in their self-will they lamed oxen." Now that detail is not mentioned in chapter 34 by Moses. But Jacob mentions it here as another reason why they are not to be considered preeminent. And then he says, "Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel." I would have to assume from what Jacob says right here that Simeon and Levi were two of the brothers that took the lead in trying to do something to Joseph. Even though the text doesn't bring it out at the time, you would have to assume that that would be the case with these two brothers. Then he tells them what would happen. I will disperse them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. In other words, they would have no territory. They would have no territory of their own. And indeed, that was the case. You look at Joshua chapter 19, verses 1 through 9, Joshua chapter 21, verses 1 through 42, and we see that's exactly what happened. Simeon and Levi received no territory because of their violence and their anger. Then, verse 8 beginning, he focuses his attention on Judah. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down to you. That indicates that Jacob is in part, at least, giving the birthright to Judah. Judah's going to have preeminence. Do you see the transformation of this son of Israel? Judah had started out just as worldly, just as secular-minded as the rest of his brothers. He has gone through a spiritual journey to the point where when he comes here, Joseph recognizes how far he's come, and he's going to indicate you've even got farther to go in the right direction. He indicates that he would be victorious over his enemies. He would have authority over the rest of his brothers. Then he continues in verse 9, Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He couches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who dares rouse him up? He's indicating that Judah has growing strength and growing courage. This brother, this son of Jacob, started out just going along with the rest of his brothers. But then he went on his own journey, his own transformation, and he found within himself this strength, this inner resolve, this courage to do right in spite of the consequences, and it's paying dividends and would continue to pay dividends. Verse 10 of this chapter is one of the most significant verses in the entire Old Testament. This verse is crucial in understanding the role of the Messiah in the New Testament. He says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Now, scholars are divided over what that phrase, until Shiloh comes. Some would say you should translate that, until he comes to Shiloh, or until he comes to whom it belongs. New American Standard Bible has it correct. King James has it correct. Until Shiloh comes. Who is Shiloh? Shiloh must be the Messiah. It can refer to no one but the Messiah, the promised one, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, Jesus, who would come from the tribe of Judah. So he says the scepter, the ruler's staff, it would not depart from Judah. It would come to the time when Shiloh would come, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Indeed, to him, Christ, shall be the obedience of the peoples. All people must obey Christ in order to be saved, in order to be justified, in order to be in the kingdom. Shiloh, the Messiah, Jesus, he is the one to whom we turn. He is the one to whom we obey. And so when Jacob says that, he is uttering a messianic prophecy. And this had to be under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. He continues praising Judah. He ties his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes. He's saying there's going to be agricultural prosperity in connection with Judah. He's going to be prosperous in whatever he does agriculturally. Notice the parallelism. Verse 11. He washes his garments in wine, notice that word, and his robes, parallel with garments, in the blood of grapes. That's a parallelism. Wine and blood of grapes. What does that indicate? That indicates in the Old Testament that every time you see the word wine, it does not necessarily mean it's intoxicating. Here it's clear what Jacob is referring to is the blood of the grape, the pure blood of the grape, which is referred to as wine. Some of my brethren and a lot of religious people say every time you see the word wine in the Bible, it's intoxicating. No, it is not. Context, context, context. You don't have to know the original Hebrew. You don't have to know the original Greek to find that out. Look at the context of the passage. It will always, just about always, tell you what is being referred to. And here, he's referring to the blood of the grape. That is the pure blood of the grape, the juice. That's wine. That's referred to as wine, as is the case with intoxicating wine, referred to as wine. It's a generic word that covers both. Context determines the meaning in every situation. So, he's talking about the fact he would be prosperous agriculturally. Verse 12, his eyes are dull from wine. Another translation says his eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth white from milk, or whiter than milk. He's referring to the way he looks. He's not saying that Judah's going to be drunk. That's not what he's referring to. He's referring to his health. How is he? He's healthy. He's healthy. And not only that, he's prosperous. He's going to be healthy and prosperous, physically speaking. And now he turns to Zebulun. Zebulun will dwell at the seashore. That's a strategic location. He's going to explain. And he shall be a haven for ships, and his flank shall be towards Sidon, the coastal city of Phoenicia. Very important strategically. You turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 33, verses 18 and 19. Of Zebulun he said, rejoice Zebulun, you're going forth, and Issachar in your tents. They will call peoples to the mountains. There they will offer righteous sacrifices, for they will draw out the abundance of the seas and the hidden treasures of the sand. In other words, Zebulun will be more sea-oriented. He'd be more naval-oriented, if you want to put it like that. He'd be right there in that strategic location. And in verse 14, Issachar is a strong donkey. That might seem to be an insult, but it's not. You're going to see why here in a moment. A strong donkey lying down between the sheepfolds. When he saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, he bowed his shoulder to bear burdens and became a slave at forced labor. This is a compliment, and then it's not a compliment. Issachar is physically strong. That's a positive, like a donkey. But he lacks courage. He lacks ambition. And because of that, he's going to eventually be conquered. He's going to become a slave himself. Verse 16, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan is going to fulfill his name. The tribe of Dan would be, indeed, a judge. Verse 17, Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a horned snake in the path, that bites the horse's heel so that his rider falls backward. Now what's that referring to? That's referring to the fact that Dan is going to be a deadly adversary. You don't mess with him. You don't mess with Dan and the Danites, because they will get you when you least expect it. Who was from the tribe of Dan? None other than Samson. Remember? Samson was of the tribe of Dan. The most powerful, strong man that ever existed. He was from that tribe himself. So he would fulfill this prophecy concerning that Jacob utters. Then, verse 19, as for Gad, raiders shall raid him, but he will raid at their heels. In other words, Dan is going to defend himself ably. His tribe, his descendants are going to defend themselves. You turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 33 once again, verse 20. Of Gad he said, blessed is the one who enlarges Gad. He lies down as a lion and tears the arm, also the crown of the head. Of Gad, then, he would be able to defend himself. You don't mess with Gad, in other words, just like you don't mess with Dan, you don't mess with Gad either. Verse 20, as for Asher, his food shall be rich, and he will yield royal dainties. Asher is going to be very fertile, very prosperous, very rich. He's going to generate a lot of food and a lot of money for the remainder of the tribes. Verse 21, Naphtali is a doe let loose. A doe let loose means they're fast, they're swift. That would be Naphtali. He would be swift. He gives beautiful words. Not only would he be swift, he would be eloquent. In other words, he could speak well in public. Verse 22, now he comes to his favorite son. Joseph is a fruitful bough, or fruitful son, another translation says. A fruitful bough by a spring. Its branches run over a wall. In other words, he's going to be fruitful beyond comparison. Once again, I refer you back over to Deuteronomy chapter 33. And in verses 13 through 17, Moses says, of Joseph he said, blessed of the Lord be his land, with the choice things of heaven, with the dew and from the deep lying beneath, and with the choice yield of the sun, and with the choice produce of the months, and with the best things of the ancient mountains, and with the choice things of the everlasting hills, and with the choice things of the earth in its fullness, and the favor of him who dwelt in the bush. Let it come to the head of Joseph, and to the crown of the head of the one distinguished among his brothers. As the firstborn of his ox, majesty is his, and his horns are as the horns of the wild ox. With them he will push the peoples all at once to the ends of the earth. He will be very prosperous. He would succeed in everything he does. Verse 23, the archers bitterly attacked him and shot at him and harassed him. In other words, Joseph's tribes, named after his two sons, would be opposed. But, verse 24, his bow remained firm, and his arms were agile from the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Joseph's tribes would be opposed, but they would eventually overcome through their might. They would succeed. From the God of your father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you, with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of your father have surpassed the blessings of my ancestors up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of the one distinguished among his brothers. So Judah receives partly the blessing of the birthright, but Joseph is distinguished. Joseph may not have the full birthright, but Joseph among his brothers is set apart. Joseph has blessings of climate, fertility, and faithfulness. Joseph has come a long way from the time that he was sold by his brothers into Egyptian slavery when he was 17 years old. Now he's well into his 30s, perhaps pushing 40 by this point, and maybe in his 50s, even though Moses doesn't tell us the full time frame involved here. Joseph is an older man, and he has been mightily successful because he's put his trust and his faith in God, the God of his fathers. And he's led his brothers to the point now where they're reunited and they're gathered with their father. So, verse 27, he concludes with Benjamin. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. Benjamin is going to be a warlike tribe, his descendants. In the morning he devours the prey, and in the evening he divides the spoil. The Benjamites were noted for their accuracy in archery. They were very accurate in that. They were right there at the forefront. Whenever a war would take place, whenever fighting would take place, there's the Benjamites right there with it. Just like Jacob foretold. Who in the New Testament is of the tribe of Benjamin? Saul, Paul, the apostle. He's from that tribe. And prior to the time that he became a child of God, does that not describe how he was? That is, a ravenous wolf, devouring the prey, dividing the spoil. He said, I thought within myself I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. He went into people's houses, members of the church, Christians, and would cast them into prison, cause them to blaspheme, and even kill them. Oh, he was unrestrained in his anger and his hatred against the church. But when he was converted, he was totally converted. And that man became the greatest evangelist the world has ever seen. He's from that tribe. Benjamin, a ravenous wolf, devouring the prey and dividing the spoil. Then he says in verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is what their father said to them when he blessed them. He blessed them, every one with the blessing appropriate to him. The blessing fit the man. It fit every one of them, from Joseph all the way down to Benjamin. Then he charged them and said to them, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. Notice, Jacob, Israel, uses that phrase, that beautiful phrase, I'm about to be gathered to my people. I'll come back to that in a second. Yes, sir?
Yes, the Saul of the Old Testament was like that too.
Yes. Oh, yes.
But he never did come to the good side of God.
That's right. He started out good, but then he turned bad. That's right. Never did come back, did he? A very, very good point. Here we see that phrase, I am about to be gathered to my people. How could Israel say that if his people weren't in existence somewhere else? This notion that there's nothing after death, that when we're dead like Rover, we're dead all over, that just doesn't hold water in the Bible. He says, I'm about to be gathered to my people. Could he be referring to the fact that we'll be gathered to my people in the grave? No, because he's going to be buried alongside his wife, separate from all of his ancestors. Gathered to my people. That's a phrase that's used over and over again in the Old Testament, referring to the fact that there is life after death. Somewhere they're in existence. We're going to see that clearly implied once we get to the book of Exodus. Once we get to the burning bush incident, you're going to see that clearly implied by the Lord. And we'll get into that detail once we get there. But here it is hinted at by Jacob. I'm going to be gathered to my people. So, he requests to be buried with his fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field from Ephron the Hittite for a burial site. There they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. There they buried Isaac and his wife Rebekah. And there I buried Leah. Now, those that deny life after death say, well, see, he's being gathered with his people. That's where they're buried. It's not referring to. Referring to the fact that he's going to be with them in another existence, in some other place besides just the grave. There's a hope involved here. Jacob wouldn't say that if he wasn't hopeful. And so that's what he's referring to. And so this detail here, he says, there I buried Leah. This is the only place where we learn about this. We're not told that before, when Leah passed away. Here, Jacob refers to the fact that he buried Leah right there in that cave. So, Jacob, Israel, had love for Leah. It wasn't the same kind of love that he had for Rachel. Rachel was the one closest to his heart. But he grew to love Leah for all that she meant to him and all that she meant to their family. And he accorded her a very high respect by burying her in that cave. The field and the cave that is in it, purchased from the sons of Heth. When Jacob finished charging his sons, he drew his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Now that is a beautiful way of describing death, the Jewish way of describing it. He drew his feet into the bed. That indicates perhaps he was sitting up on the side of the bed when he was telling them this. So you can see him lying back in the bed. He slowly moves his feet into the bed and they cover him. And then it says he breathed his last. He went smoothly. And then Moses adds, he was gathered to his people. I don't think Moses is referring to the fact that his body was buried in the cave of Machpelah. Fully believe what Moses is referring to is he, that is Jacob, Israel, was gathered to his people with Abraham and Isaac and Rachel and Leah. He was there with them in that other plane of existence, the Hadean realm. Any questions, comments before we move into chapter 50, the last chapter of Genesis? All right. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Further indicating that when he says gathered to his people, he's referring to his soul leaving his body. His body is still there on the bed. And Joseph is now kissing him. Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. We know about embalming. Some more than others. Some who work in that kind of business know about embalming in this day and time. When he's referring to embalming in Egypt, it's mummification. He's going to be mummified. You've seen the pictures of King Tut, the mummy of King Tut, and the mummy of different pharaohs. That's the kind of process they went through. If you've done any study on it, you know how elaborate that was, and Moses describes it. So the physicians embalmed Israel. Now 40 days were required for it, for such is the period required for embalming. It's a 40-day period of mummification of the body. Then he adds, and the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. That mourning period was almost as long as the mourning period for Pharaoh. You think about this. Jacob, Israel, an old man, when he finally gets to Egypt, is so dignified and makes such an impact on Pharaoh and his court and on the people of Egypt because, of course, of what his son has done for the nation. But he himself has made such an impact on the people of Egypt that they mourn over his passing as they would over Pharaoh. That tells you how far Israel has come in his journey. Remember, he started out way back yonder, deceiving his father. You know, with his mother Rebekah deceiving his father about who he was. And then he goes over here to where Laban is, and they have that back and forth, two con artists at work, as it were. But even at that point, Jacob is beginning to change, and that process continues and continues and continues until the point where when Joseph returns and he's aware that he's alive, his spirit is revived. He knows there's hope. And now he's passed away in Egypt, and the people of Egypt are regarding him as a distinguished, esteemed individual. Yes.
Everybody, that's like when we go with the flag here, half-mast.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just like a passing of a former president or a very important dignitary or a very important person, you know, a national period of mourning is set forth. Well, that's the way they did with Jacob. Israel was regarded in that light. When the days of mourning for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I have found favor in your sight, please speak to Pharaoh. Now, why is he asking permission? Because it was taboo for Pharaoh to speak to those who were in mourning. Joseph and his brothers were still in mourning over the passing of their father. My father made me swear, saying, behold, I am about to die, in my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now, therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, then I will return. Pharaoh said, Go up and bury your father as he made you swear. In other words, because he's got all these responsibilities still as second in command over Egypt, he asks for permission to go. Pharaoh grants it. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the household of Joseph and his brothers and his father's household. They left only their little ones and their flocks and the herds in the land of Goshen. There also went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. You know that must have been an impressive entourage. That must have been an impressive caravan going all the way from Egypt to Canaan. Pharaoh's the representatives, the servants, the elders of the land of Egypt, all the dignitaries, all the high-ranking officials of Egypt, they're going with Joseph to Canaan to honor him as he's burying his father. You talk about respect. You talk about honor and esteem that they had for this family. This is unreal. Verse 10, when they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and sorrowful lamentation. And he observed 7 days mourning for his father. An additional week he spends mourning for his father's passing. Don't you know that Joseph was overwhelmed with all sorts of emotions when Jacob passed? He had been separated from his father all those years, from the time he was 17 to the time he was in his early 30s. All those years separated, then they reunited for all those years spent in Egypt. And now he's finally gone. Yes? Leaders recognize each other. They recognize power. They recognize dignity. They recognize that it factor that they have. You got to have an it factor to be president of the United States. You got to have an it factor to be king or to be a prime minister. Jacob had that it factor. Pharaoh recognized it. He knew it. He knew that Joseph didn't get this from a vacuum. Joseph had to have gotten this from his father. He was very interested to meet his father, and he now knows where it comes from. And they're giving Jacob, Israel, the kind of send-off that a dignitary would receive. A king, a prime minister, if you will. Very, very interesting. So, verse 11. Now when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning for the Egyptians." Notice that. The Canaanites see all these Egyptians in this entourage, and they assume that Joseph is an Egyptian. They're saying, wow, this is something for the Egyptians, a great period of mourning, not knowing that it's for Jacob, Israel. Therefore, it was named Abel Mizraim, which is beyond the Jordan. Abel Mizraim means the riverbed of Egypt. That's the nickname it was given, where they spent their 7 days of mourning. Thus his sons did for him as he had charged them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field for a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So now everything is ended, everything is good, it's a happily ever after, right? Well, not necessarily. Notice the epilogue, I call it. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him?" They still are worried. They had lived in fear to an extent up to this point. They took what Joseph was saying with not a grain of salt, but they had this reservation in the back of their mind. He's got to hold a grudge. This is too good to be true. All that we did to him back then, and we were wrong for doing it, he's going to get his revenge. Now that Dad's gone, it's going to happen. They're worried about it. So now watch this. They sent a message to Joseph saying, your father charged before he died, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. And now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His reaction is not, yes, sir, now you need to go to prison. No, he bawls like a baby. He cries. That's the character of the man. The character of the man was that he wasn't going to hold that grudge. He wasn't going to exact his revenge. He had been reunited with his brothers. He forgave them. They were reunited with their father. And now he's going to reassure them of that same truth. Then his brothers also came and fell down before him. There's another instance, the final instance of Joseph's dream coming true. Remember, they would bow down before him. They bowed down to him already several times. And once again, they bowed down before him. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? Am I in the place of God? You know, that's a phrase that sometimes we take for granted, but we need to take more seriously, especially in the Lord's church. Unfortunately, some of my brethren, and I won't go into detail in the brotherhood in general, some of my brethren want to put themselves in the place of God over matters of no consequence, over matters of expediency. That's something that must never happen. Unfortunately, it has happened in years gone by. Unfortunately, it still happens, even as we speak. But we've got to make sure that we follow the instructions of Paul in Romans 14 on matters of expediency and matters of no consequence, and not bind our opinions as matters of faith. We can't make laws for God. We can't put ourselves in God's place. That's a good rule of thumb to live by in matters of no consequence. So that's what he's telling him. Am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. I've got that verse underlined with 3 exclamation points to the side of it. That is a critical verse when we're talking about providence. What a declaration of God's providence by Joseph. You meant evil, but God meant it for good. How can we distinguish that in our lives? We can't when it's happening to us. But, as the psalmist would, we can look back at the latter end and see God's hand in it. Romans 8:28 is the key verse to understand. We know that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Notice he didn't say all things will be good, because they won't. He says all things will work together for good to who? Them who love the Lord. Did he promise it would be a bed of roses? No. Did he promise it would be a life of ease? No. He did promise, though, it would work out. Yes, sir.
Question before we round up. The latter part of verse 20 that says to save many people alive.
Yes.
Of course they are alive. So does it mean to get them converted of their wicked ways, to harden the church?
It could be. I think the primary thing that he's talking about is the fact that he saved people's lives in Egypt through the famine. That, in other words, God intended for him, Joseph, to be the one who would save lives during the 7 years of famine. But in a secondary sense, it could possibly mean that. Yeah, that's an interesting take on that. He would be saving many people. They didn't intend for it to happen that way. God worked it for that. But you see, it takes people who are doing God's will to execute God's plan. God's going to use somebody. He may not use me, but he'll use somebody to to accomplish his purposes. We've got to decide and determine whether or not we're going to be a part of that. That's where Romans 8:28 kicks in for us. So, verse 21, verse 21. Therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. He reassures them. Nothing's going to happen to you. Nothing's going to happen to your descendants. We're all in this together. Now, Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Notice, please, the continued shortening of life. We've come a long way from the beginning where Methuselah lived 969, and others lived 930 and 900 and 800 plus. Now it's down to 110. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons. Also the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. He trusted in God's land promise. This indicates that Joseph died before his brothers died. Interesting. Also, we've had a fast forward again from the time of verse 21 to the time of verse 22. There's a skip over a number of years to the time of Joseph's death. Verse 25, that is. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. This was carried out by the Israelites, as we will see, when they exited Egypt in the Exodus. Exodus 13:19, Joshua 24:32 indicates that Joseph's bones indeed were taken out of Egypt and carried into the promised land. Verse 26, so Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed. Joseph was mummified, just like his father, just like the pharaohs had been mummified, and placed in a coffin in Egypt. So he is accorded the same honor and dignity as any other high-ranking official in the land. And so when Genesis ends, we're thinking the descendants of Jacob, the descendants of Abraham, are in a very good place. They're in a fertile place in Egypt, and everything's good. Well, we're about to enter the book of Exodus next week. Things are going to change drastically. And we'll talk about the Pharaoh of the Exodus and the Pharaoh of the oppression in connection with our introductory statement.